Tension space, an opportunity for failure to make your successes more meaningful. Anthony Maddox.
My name is Cade, and I want to welcome you to the Desert Cube Primer. I'm here with Bones today, and we are going to endeavor to provide you with the tools you need to understand, explore, and perhaps design your very own Desert Cube.
That's right. My name is Bones. You might know me from judging a bunch of Cube events recently or from previous years of CubeCon. But before I was a traveling Cube judge, I was one of the people that you might ask about Desert Cube. I'm certainly not the originator of the concept, and I'll get into the history more deeply in a moment. But I had the only true desert, which we'll also define later, at the first KubeCon, which introduced the concept to a lot more people than knew about it before, or at least that's what I've been told.
As a note, any of the resources that we reference are going to be linked in the show description below. So, without any ado, Bones, what is a Desert Cube?
A desert cube is a cube in which there is no basic land station. This comes with huge asterisks, which we'll define throughout the rest of the episode. But the general thought and the way the original was pitched is there is no land station. You must draft all the lands you intend to play. The two main kinds are true deserts, there is no basic land station at all, and partial or semi deserts, in which the types of lands you can get are restricted in some way. Often, only one type of basic land is available.
Do desert cubes necessarily need to be themed to be considered deserts?
Not at all. The name comes from the fact that the first one had a desert theme, and that's just something that has become synonymous with the concept. But land restricted as a concept has no requirement to be desert themed. Much like all of Cube, you can ignore as many rules as you like.
So, take us back. Where does the desert idea originate, as far as we know?
As far as we know, is a key part of that phrase because much of it has been lost flavorfully to the sands of time. The original desert, which was called Corinths by user Loxodon Meyerark on the Riptide Lab forums, was being referenced on those forums as far back as May 2014. It was hugely color imbalanced toward red. It also broke Singleton liberally with between 10 and 28 copies of Kindle and or Desert from Arabian Nights. I've seen those numbers go up and down in various versions of the list. The original list that I saw, I cannot find anymore because it was on CubeTutor, which is now gone, unfortunately. The Cube Cobra version of the Corinth Desert is playing a much safer number.
So, where do you fit into all this, Bones?
So, my history with Cube, my first cube was just a budget cube of all my favorite cards under $5. I also made a Lorwyn Morningtide set cube, but for a long time, I was more interested in custom set design than cube design. And I would just, occasionally play these cubes that I had built, but that wasn't where my focus lied. But when I saw spoilers for Hour of Devastation in 2017 and the Mechanical Deserts Matter theme, having read about the Desert Cube concept at some point on the MTG Cube subreddit, I saw an opportunity, a mechanically desert themed desert cube. And so over the course of tuning the list into 2018 sometime, I started to explore themes of landfall and cycling to help players have something useful to do, whether they are low or high on lands in the game. I was very interested in lands mattering, especially in the draft, and then mattering even more than normal in the games. Eventually, this focus on landfall in all five colors led me to look even more at Zendikar. And eventually, the creative that I am, I envisioned the world of Amonkhet being overlaid onto Zendikar like the Phyrexians did during the invasion. And then we had a more unique name, Amonkar.
So, let's use Amankar as kind of a baseline here to talk some numbers, because I'm sure that's a big question for people working on their own desert cubes. How do you start thinking about the structure of a desert?
Absolutely. And that is honestly one of the most important pieces of information that I want to communicate. My starting point was an exact draft of 3 packs of 18, so 432 cards. And of those 432, 1/3 being land, so 144. It is my memory that this is the ratio and the numbers that I saw on the Corinth Desert on CubeTutor in 2017. That version of the list I have never found since, but it has worked very well for me. I, at some point, increased to 480 cards, which is what the current versions of the Corinth list show. And I increased my land count to near 160. So that 1/3 ratio remained. And I then was able to draft 4 packs of 15, which is where the 480 number comes from. I still prefer to draft 3 packs of 18, but it is nice to have the option if you have a group of players that are especially trepidatious about the restriction. You can draft 4 packs of 15, and it's a little bit of a safety net. 1/3 land is typical of most lists, and there are slight deviations from that in either direction. But for me, I like to start with 1/3 lands, and then 1/3 of those lands to be basic, which then gives you 2/3 of the lands to play around with to express your themes, set the tempo of the format, determine what the color fixing is going to look like, things like that. You can also dilute the lands with wastes if you'd like to make colors a little bit harder to come by, make the number of lands a good number, because the wastes will go pretty late, and then the players who are lower on lands will have something that they can take, even if it's not especially good. I like to use colorless utility lands such as desert or quicksand. That way, if these don't fix for color as well as the other ones, there is still something you can do with your lands.
And certainly these numbers change a little bit if you are not a true or full desert, if you are offering maybe a single color in the land station.
Absolutely. So, as an example of some partial deserts, the Devoid Cube is probably the most well-known partial desert or semi-desert. That's by Isticle or Dan, and you have an endless access to waste, which is a basic land, wastes. And his list is 86 lands out of a 375 card cube, so 23% land, 10% less than mine in terms of ratio, and many fewer cards than mine, 375 versus 480. But you have that basic land station. Now, the cool thing about Devoid is that it is a Devoid cube. All the cards are colorless, but many of them do cost color. So if you want to produce any color, you have to draft every land you want that is going to produce those colors. Otherwise, you're going to have to fall back on the waste in the land station, and they don't produce any color at all.
So the golden rule for the desert is roughly 1/3, just to highlight that.
Yeah, for a true desert in which you're not providing any lands to the players, I like to use 1/3. And most designers fall somewhere between 31% on the most restrictive one I've seen up into the 38% range.
And we will certainly explore some specific examples and that maybe highlight different elements of those numbers. But one of the things that can scare people away from desert cubes is the fear that they may not actually draft a functional deck. How would you speak to players or designers who are concerned that way?
Absolutely. Fear is a huge factor in this format. After the first CubeCon, I had a lot of players come up to me and say, "Hey, I was really interested in drafting your Desert Cube. I was too afraid to try it, but I watched some games or I watched the draft and it was really interesting, and I wish I had tried it." And I have heard that again and again. And I think the safety net of lands is so present in cube design that just the thought of taking it away without considering what the environment may do to benefit you in the absence of that safety net is very scary, and is understandably so. What I would say is every person who has told me they were afraid first and then drafted it immediately said they wanted to do it again or design their own. It is such a fun puzzle, as we alluded to in the opening quote. That tension space has such a satisfying payoff when you succeed with this limitation that it is really compelling for players. And I just encourage anyone who is scared or skeptical to give it a shot, because I do think that you will like it more than you think you will.
Yeah, we've described it kind of like going up on a high dive for the first time, where it looks a lot scarier than it actually is. And as you noted, it highlights this tension between drafting your resources versus drafting your payoffs.
Exactly. Yeah. One of the most exciting parts of it to me during the draft, and many cube designers will say that the draft is their favorite part and the games are an afterthought. Especially true here, because while you're drafting, you're making these really interesting decisions, not between do I have enough enablers versus payoffs, do I have enough threats versus removal, but what colors do I need to produce and what colors can I produce? So you're making really interesting decisions, like taking, for example, a white-blue dual land really highly, even over threats, because you're in white-blue. There's only so many white-blue options for fixing. You've got to take it, or it may not come back. The player who is only partially in one of those colors might take it before you see it again, just because it's a land that can produce something that they need. If it's on color for you, that is enormous. And so you get this really interesting thing where whenever bombs are coming around, it may be too dangerous for you to take them. You may have to have a land because of the position that you are in the draft. And another thing is that there's usually a cost associated with color production to make the basic lands really shine as high draft picks. So for example, if all the lands enter tapped, or all the lands cost a life to get color out of, like Ramunap Ruins or the Pain land cycle, then basics have this value inherent to them, coming in untapped, providing a color, not hurting at all, that is really interesting and again doesn't exist in many other cube spaces.
In this vein of structure, what does needing to draft your lands do to concepts like mana curve?
Mana curve is something that I look at very hard whenever I am designing a desert cube or designing for the desert, just because there will be a number of players who end up with 15 or 16 lands. I have a really large cycling theme because of that, to help players get down cards that they can't afford to cast, or if they are just missing their land drop over and over, give them some opportunity to pitch their non-lands to try to draw into a land. In that vein, I want to keep the curve as low as possible, as often as possible, so that if they are stuck on 2 or 3 lands over the course of the game, they still have actions they can take to play to the board, to respond to threats, that kind of thing. And at that 4, 5, and 6 cost, I really want cards that either have cycling or channel, something to do at the lower mana value, or are so compelling that it pays you off for getting to the 4th land number or 5th or whatever it may be.
So you have a great way of talking to players during drafts, and I've had pleasure to draft your desert cubes a couple of times. You have a great way to talk to players to help keep them along the correct path. Talk a little bit about that.
So I am very careful with my players, perhaps over careful. You don't ever want to annoy your players, especially whenever you're inviting them to an intentionally tense draft situation. But I will confirm with everyone that they know how Desert Cube works. And then after the first pack, say something like, all right, if you don't have about 6 lands at this point, you might want to think about that in the next pack. And then again, after pack 2, something to the effect of, if you don't have around 12 lands at this point, you have 1 pack left to figure that out. And if everyone has drafted a desert already, maybe I skip that step, and it's not something that you can ensure at events that whatever judge is going to be running your cube that they'll get this spiel. But it is something that I definitely want to make everyone crystal clear on, because you can hear the conceit of the cube and then get lost in the draft and not be thinking about it. So I just want to make sure that reminder has been spoken to the players a couple of times. Like, if you aren't where you need to be in pack 3, you are very quickly running out of time to get somewhere that you're happy with.
To underline that, with your baseline numbers at 432 with 144 lands, that means each player in an 8-person draft is going to expect to have about 18 lands to choose from.
That's right. And so since a third of my lands are basic and another third or so are colorless, they're going to end up with some probably extra lands that either don't fix for their colors, if they fix for color at all. And that's probably where those excess lands are going to go. I don't expect anybody to play 18 most of the time, but you do want to have that kind of safety between 16 and 18 where players don't feel obligated to continue taking lands once they've reached a certain number. Although, this is a very common strategy of players when they hear the concept is, I will just take lands no matter what.
Yeah.
Even, regardless of color, regardless of what the land does, I'll take lands because it will hurt the other players in the cube. This isn't a very friendly strategy, but, if you're trying to spike the draft, this is something that could appeal to you. I have perhaps corrected for that in my own environment by making such a large density of colorless lands. One of the players in my local group who chose this strategy and ended up with more than 20 lands discovered after the draft that he had drafted 10 that could produce color. I had such a large density of colorless, and those are the lands that are wheeling around, that he was taking without thinking about what they do for him. He struggled a lot to actually produce color. I think the draft is fairly self-correcting in that if players are seeing lands less and less and less and can kind of intuit that someone might have this strategy, they need to take lands more highly. And then sure, at the end of the draft, perhaps 7 people have 16 and that person has over 20, ideally they will have built functional decks in a way that punishes the player that attempted this little maneuver.
So the numbers we've set out and the structure makes a lot of sense for 8 players in a pod. What can you do if you're trying to work with fewer than 8 players?
So if you are, I'll use my own cube as an example. If I'm missing players, my my first instinct will be to switch cubes. Unless we have advertised this is the Desert Cube night and we're going to draft Desert Cube no matter what, one of my instincts is going to be to switch to a cube that is friendlier to a lower player number, or even designed for a lower player count. In the case where we are going to play Desert and we have less than 8 players, I will switch to 4 packs of 15, the number that is intended for the entire queue to be drafted. But at least then, with 60 cards, you're going to see roughly 20 lands a player in that case. And then hopefully we can correct for the absent players. You do want to make sure that in the undrafted portion, there's not like an outsized ratio of lands in that section that's not going to be touched by anyone. It can be uncomfortable to know what's outside the draft for some players, if they're really specific on strategy. But there are certainly Desert Cubes designed to be played by fewer players. One of my favorites is the Desert Rose by Nick, who you have already spoken with in another episode. And that one uses 4 packs of 13. There's also some versions that do a Hausman draft or Minneapolis draft. But the idea is if you have a full-size desert, 432 or 480, and you're only got 4 players, you do need to make some concessions to the draft style to make sure that people are going to get enough lands. That can be very tricky.
While there are pitfalls, there are certainly good reasons to do a desert cube. What are some things that may point designers toward exploring a desert environment?
My favorite use case for it, besides the fact that I really enjoy the draft itself and the tension that we've described, is when the lands that you choose are going to reflect back your theme, your goals, something along those lines. A good example is the deserts from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. They are actual deserts. In the flavor, in the name, in the text, they give desert as the vibe. And then in the mechanic, when you're hurting each player, life totals going down. This is a type of tension and a type of mood that is being set because these are the lands the players must play. Another example is the Triskaideka fixing from Duskmourn. That can provide a kind of haunted house theme or just a tension where life totals are super important for the way that the fixing is going to turn on for both players at the same time. I have another desert cube called the Labyrinth, which is themed around gates and being in a labyrinth. So there are 4 copies of each gate, and that is most of the fixing in the cube. And so players are going to see a lot of gates, a lot of slow tapped lands that enter and do nothing, but are gates and have this flavor that is being reinforced every time you turn around. There's another gate in your face, and that is a way that designers can kind of make their players feel something about the design in a way that normally you'd only have access to the non-land suite to do.
And beyond the flavorful theming, those give you so many knobs to turn for the kind of gameplay experience you want your players to have, since those lands are going to shape the speed of your format.
Precisely. And as you are quick to point out, when we design Cube, we are choosing what cards the players have access to. When you design a Desert Cube, you're choosing every card your players have access to. And so the things that you want your players to do, instead of being half of their deck, will be their entire deck.
There are as many different ways to craft a desert as there are designers. Give us some examples of variations that people have explored on this theme.
Absolutely. So 2 of the more well-known ones are Dragons of Winter's Night by Chill, MTG, and The Monopoly by Uberbear. So Dragons of Winter's Night is a snow desert, and there's a fun fact that many people know where Antarctica is technically a desert because of its precipitation. And so Snow Desert was kind of a natural progression, I feel, of the theme, and Chill has done a really interesting job reinforcing it with the Dragons theme, which is where the name comes from, and giving it a kind of an artifact bend. And because there's snowlands, plentiful snowlands, and there's a snow theme, you really get this strong thematic sense of where you are and what you are experiencing. The Monopoly Cube doesn't have the same specific harshness applied to it. It's a more lighthearted concept based on a board game, but it has treasure tokens aplenty, and the flavor is not as directly tied into the mechanics. It is a Desert Cube true. And then the treasure tokens that are everywhere give you a little bit more access to mana than you would typically get in a Desert Cube. So there are many, many different ways you can approach it. Another snow desert, just like Chill's Dragons of Winter's Night, is by Deinonychus, Midwinter. That one is Kaldheim themed, which Chill has cards from, of course, but Deinonychus leans into very strongly with Midwinter, and I really enjoy that one. It has like a sagas theme and equipment and a lot of unique takes. Even though, Snow Desert you might think is only so deep a well, they still feel very distinct from each other. There's also the Giver Cube by Keldon, the Oinkinator, and that one is particularly harsh. It has a lot of wastes. Colored pips are very difficult to use, unlike the Monopoly, for example. And that one is only 3 packs of 17 and 408 cards. So that's only going to average with 128 lands, 16 lands per player. That's the 31% lands that I referenced earlier. And so fixing will be especially tense over the course of that, and colors certainly, because there are so many colorless lands.
You also mentioned a few cubes that provide one basic land type perhaps out of the land box, or that really restrict what you have access to. Do you have a couple of those in mind?
Absolutely. I already referenced the Devoid Cube by Dan. There's also the Fire Swamp by Brett, AI Bretty. That one has no white or blue monocolor cards or islands or plains in the cube at all. The only land you have access to after the draft is Basic Swamp, and then it is very black leaning. But because it's so black leaning, only 17.5% of the cube is lands. So that's roughly half of my third number. And then you get a really interesting knob to change there, because on top of making it swamp themed and Jund colors, it's also very punishing. There are a lot of rats, there's little to no life gain, the games can be brutal and quick, and it very much embodies being trapped in a fiery swamp. In the similar vein, Parker, or Land of Mordor's Pulp Nouveau Cube, only allows players to have swamps, but is noir themed with detectives and is not nearly as harsh, doesn't have any of the same kind of swampy vibe to it, even though players only get access to basic swamp at the end of the draft. It has 25% fixing and 432 cards like a more traditional desert, unlike Brett's 360 card swamp. One more color imbalanced. This one is a true desert in that it provides you no lands after the draft at all, but it does not have any white, is Gwen Decker's Loam Cube. This is another really cool one that is mechanical first. You start with a Life from the Loam in your graveyard, and then you are drafting a 4-color cube, leaning toward green, around the concept of filling your graveyard very easily. Everybody can do it right from the start of the game. And then your lands, it's still about a third, but your lands are easier to access because you get that Life from the Loam so early. And then as long as you have access to green mana, can start pulling lands out of your graveyard directly.
You also mentioned a few smaller form desert cubes. Do you have a few of those that we could suggest for folks who maybe have smaller play groups that they would want to try this with?
So I did mention Nyx Desert Rose. That one is a 260 card cube for 4 players. It has an interesting conceit where players are given the Urzatron, Urza's Mine, Urza's Tower, and Urza's Power Plant lands in their pool guaranteed. So they have this 3 land baseline to start from, and then they draft a desert cube. Normally they are stuck on what colors they can produce based on what they draft, but they always have access to these 3 colorless lands, and whether they want to play them or not is up to them, is up to the needs of their deck. For example, there are a lot of prototype cards from the Brothers War, and you might not play the Urzatron and just play them for their prototype cost, or if you find ways to assemble Urzatron, you can pay the full price for them. Another one is the Post-Apocalyptic Cube by Dinrova Horror, or Greg. This one is really interesting because the conceit is that you have drafted all that you need to play. There are no tokens, there are no emblems, there's no basic land station. You draft, you build your deck, and you play. This concept has also carried over to a number of bar cubes. Bar cubes are famous for wanting to be taken on the go and not need any accoutrement to go with them. Often no tokens, no counters, that kind of thing, no dice, no playmat. You just play unsleeved with what you've got. Well, why have a basic land station at all? If you increase the cube by a certain amount and fill it with lands, and you change your draft just a little bit, you can also have that part taken care of, and then you can just trim down deck size and immediately begin playing.
So there are a lot of numbers and a lot of different versions of a desert cube to consider. You have done a lot of research into this topic. If folks want to follow up with you, maybe learn a little bit more, dive a little deeper into the math or the flavor of it, how should folks get in touch with you?
I am Lucky Looter on Discord. I will also recommend that any of the curators that we've mentioned the projects of are assuredly happy to talk about their projects as well, especially if they have deviated from the numbers I've given. They have most likely very good reasons for those deviations that they'd love to explain to you. I'd also love to recommend Parker, who has the Pulp Nouveau Cube. The article on Lucky Paper that Parker wrote, which is a tribute to Drafting Basic Lands, includes a little bit of the history of the format and is a design diary about the Pulp Nouveau Cube.
In summary, what would you tell people who are thinking about desert?
You should do it. The Desert Cube is a tension that you will not find in any other cube quite like this. It can be daunting, but I can only say that everyone who has gone in to one of my cubes' tents has come out eager to try again or build their own. It is an experience that is so unlike other cubes and is such a satisfying puzzle during the draft that you should try it at least once.
Bones, thank you so much for your expertise on this topic, for sharing so much along the way.
Thank you for having me. I have had this on my mind for a while. People have asked me for what resources should I look at when building my first desert, and I'm always happy to talk with anyone about cube design. But repeating some of the same pieces of information each time, it just seemed more and more like something a piece of media might help with. And actually, Joe Anderson of the California Cube fame was like, "Where should I start with desert?" And I was like, "I don't know. Let me think about that." And so that is actually the most recent reason that I have to have reached out to you about this kind of thing. So thank you for giving me the platform to put something like this out there.